This is Dan Schneider. I'm joined once again by Mitchell Hadley. This time we're going to be talking about American television in the 1960s. Mitch, welcome. For those who do not know, you can give just a brief background of who you are and what you do.
Sure. Hi, Dan, and thanks again for having me on again. I am a classic TV historian. I write at the blog itsabouttv.com. I've written the book The Electronic Mirror, which talks about what we can learn about classic television, what we can learn about TV, and what we can learn about ourselves. And I try to make classic television topical and contemporary for people who might not know that much about it or just like to relive things that they remember from when they were young.
This time we're going to start off talking about news organizations. We've talked in a few of the other shows about some of the big events that news covered. We mentioned people like Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite. But you wanted to talk a little bit about the rise of the network news departments. So why don't you take it from here?
Sure. Well, I think one of the interesting things about the 60s is that network news anticipated, in a way, the growing importance of news in television. If you look at the two major players in network news, CBS and NBC, both of them expanded their evening news broadcasts from 15 minutes to a half an hour in the fall of 1963. Now, it was prescient for them that they did it only about a month or so before the assassination of President Kennedy. So that kind of coincidentally became a theme as to how the networks were understanding news coverage. And of course, the coverage of the assassination not only dominated television, but it changed the way a lot of people saw television news, in that if for the first time TV news supplanted traditional forms of news gathering like newspapers. You could read the Times on Saturday morning and find out about the Kennedy assassination, everything that you had already heard on the networks Friday night and Saturday. So it was the first time that that TV news actually started to impress upon people how important it could be as an immediate source of information. Now, it wasn't only the assassination. I mean, if you look at the evolution of news coverage in the 60s, there was plenty that was going on before that that helped anticipate the need for larger news services in the networks. I'm thinking specifically of the civil rights movement, because you also had the March on Washington happening in 1963. And although that was not covered live for the most part, it was covered in special reports by news outlets, and they covered things that were going on in the South. They covered Martin Luther King. They covered the race disturbances that were beginning, the problems they were having in Birmingham, in other parts of the South, the Freedom Riders, things like that. You didn't have Vietnam as it would become in the 60s, but it was still there. There was a growing consciousness that there was something going on in Southeast Asia, and that we were advisors. We weren't heavily involved in it yet. At least the public didn't know the extent to which the United States was involved in Vietnam, but they knew that there was something going on out there. There were other things that were going on, of course, that had been going on for quite some time. The Cold War, the space race, everything going on from the Berlin blockade to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So news was becoming more and more banging on the door for attention. And the two networks, CBS and NBC, to their credit, recognized that this was going to require, I think, a greater commitment to news than they had been showing previously. Hence the expansion from 15 minutes to 30 minutes. They understood that while they could be on hand for breaking news coverage, for big stories, Sputnik, uh, the Civil Rights March, they still needed to have the capacity to be able to cover more news on a daily basis. So I think that was one of the most important things that happened in terms of news coverage. You know, we think about it today in terms of all news channels, which I don't think are really news channels at all anymore. But even the concept of having a network like CNN broadcasting news 24 hours a day, we take it for granted now. And you compare that to how it was in the early 60s when the networks did 15 minutes of news 5 nights a week. And you might have some news on Saturday or Sunday, but it wasn't a priority the way it would become. And we see that at the beginning of the 60s. Now, to balance that off, by the end of the 60s, we see the beginning of news magazine shows. And that starts on a regular basis with 60 Minutes. Now, people may not remember that when 60 Minutes first premiered, it was not a weekly program. It was on once a month. Then it was on twice a month. And the hosts were Mike Wallace and Harry Reasoner. And later, the show would expand to becoming a weekly show. Later on, it would move to Sunday nights, where it has stayed ever since. It's become a staple of television. It has gone on to breed a lot of other shows that have tried with some degrees of success to copy the format of being a television news magazine. But 60 Minutes is still the first, and that happens in the late 1960s. So already by the end of the decade, we've seen two of the fundamental parts of contemporary news coverage on TV. We've seen the network news expanding. We've seen the invention or introduction of TV news magazines. Now, there were also things that the networks would do in other ways. NBC had a white paper show that would run once a month, but it would run for 90 minutes. It was called First Tuesday, and it ran on the first Tuesday of every month. That only ran for a couple of years, but had it gone on, I think it would have provided some interesting competition to 60 Minutes, because it took a longer look at more stories. It had a little more varied content at times than 60 Minutes did. It would have been an interesting program to follow. CBS itself had their CBS Reports, which Murrow had played a big part in at the beginning, but those continued through the 60s. And what people became frustrated about with these shows was that they were often on against each other or against other more popular programs, so that they were almost being set up to fail. The networks would say, we don't have a budgetary reason to continue to show all these news and public affairs programs because you don't watch them. And the critics, responding on behalf of the viewers, would say, well, the reason they don't have such high ratings is because they're either opposing each other or you're putting them on in a death time slot where nothing else is going to compete against them. So it's kind of a chicken and egg type of scenario where for whatever reasons, we don't see the growth of other kinds of informational programs. That controversy has always remained. And I think that while we can argue that there is more of that on television today than there was in the 60s, I would also argue that much of it is not hard news. It is entertainment disguised as news and information. It is sometimes a partisan infomercial. It is sometimes very lightweight news that really gets dragged out to fill its time slot. So there was a lot going on in the 60s, a lot that developed, some for better, some for worse. And the other thing that I want to mention too, because I think I like to look in television for hints or precursors of things to come. And I don't want to leave ABC out of the mix here. Now, ABC was the last network to expand to a half an hour with its news. It did that in 1967 with Peter Jennings as the host. He was only, I believe, 27 when he took over the evening news, and that was when it was still 15 minutes. He was a young Canadian broadcaster, and ABC wanted to try and introduce a young face to compete with Cronkite on CBS, Huntley and Brinkley on NBC. He was the first to admit that it wasn't a great success. He wasn't seasoned enough. He didn't really want to be an anchorman at that point in time. He wanted to be a foreign correspondent, which is eventually what ABC allowed him to go out and do. Report from the field, be a reporter. And that's what he did to work his way up the ladder again to where in the 80s, when he does become an anchorman, he has the credentials, he has the hard news background, he has the gravitas that's needed to succeed in that position. But what ABC did do in the late 60s was introduce their own version of 60 Minutes and First Tuesday. It was called ABC Scope. And it started out at least as a show that would cover different aspects of the news, some hard, some lighthearted. Along the way, it began to evolve to the point that by the end of the 60s, it had become a show that was exclusively devoted to covering the war in Vietnam. So ABC Scope became a Vietnam War program, and for 3 years, every week it reported on the war in Vietnam and what was going on and what the American position was, what the news was coming out of the Pentagon, what the news was from the battlefield. It was maybe the first example we can see of a weekly news show devoted to the war in Vietnam. And I think that is important because it shows the growing presence of Vietnam in the news, and it shows a network that's devoting a weekly time slot to that. Now, it didn't get clearance from all the affiliates. Some of them would preempt it completely for their own programming. Some of them would replay it on a Sunday afternoon or early Sunday evening. I've even seen it on Sunday mornings in some area. So it isn't as well known, and it didn't get the kind of attention or clearance that it probably should have. But it was there, and it was showing that TV news was starting to become a more familiar scene in the agenda. It was becoming more important as an issue on television.
So a couple of questions then. Why was ABC News the last? I know in the post-Dumont network landscape, ABC was sort of a spin-off of NBC, and it really wasn't until the mid to late 1970s with Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley, the Gary Marshall hits, that ABC ever became the number one network. They were always number 3 for about 15, 20 years. Was it they just weren't making enough money?
Yeah, they didn't have a huge news organization. They didn't have a strong affiliate lineup, and they didn't always get clearance for their shows, news or otherwise, from their affiliates. A lot of their affiliates were split affiliations. In other words, they may have carried some ABC programming, but they were primarily a CBS or an NBC affiliate. And in the case of the news, they would usually opt for one of those two rather than their own news. But if you look at the history of the ABC evening news, I mean, when we join ABC News in Progress in 1960 at the beginning of the decade, the anchorman is John Daly. And that's the same John Daly who's also hosting What's My Line on CBS on Sunday nights. And you may be thinking, why is a network employing a game show host as their news anchor? Well, in fact, Daly was a newsman long before he had ever gotten into any kind of entertainment programming. He had worked with CBS Radio. He had announced the bombing of Pearl Harbor on the radio. He'd also announced the death of President Roosevelt on the radio. He followed Patton in Europe, reported on the famous incident where Patton slapped an enlisted man who was in the hospital. So Daley was a credible newsman. We shouldn't say that just because he was the host of the news that made it a joke. But it wasn't a well-funded operation. Daley moves on. They get John Cameron Swayze, who used to host the news on NBC. They go through a whole cycle of anchors. They have Edward P. Morgan and Howard K. Smith. They have Howard K. Smith and Frank Reynolds. They have Frank Reynolds alone. They have Howard K. Smith and Harry Reasoner. They have Harry Reasoner and Barbara Walters. They bring Frank Reynolds back with Peter Jennings and Max Robinson. We've gone all the way.
Max Robinson was the first black anchorman at one point.
That is correct. That is correct. And by the time Maroon Arledge takes over ABC News as well as sports, he's put together a really good news organization. And World News Tonight was a top rated and top quality newscast with their rotating anchor system. And then after Frank Reynolds' death, when Peter Jennings took over completely, it was a very quality news organization. But to look at the way it was in the early 60s, you'd be surprised by that. As a matter of fact, for people who go on YouTube and look at breaking news events such as the death of President Kennedy, you watch NBC and CBS's coverage, which is very professional, if somewhat flustered because of what's going on. You turn over and watch ABC's news coverage, and they're literally assembling the set in the background while they're reading the bulletins. So they're pulling curtains, they're adjusting lights, they're bringing in cords. The coverage was actually, for all that, pretty good and pretty professional. But it certainly did not give the aura of professionalism when you're building the set on the fly. So I think one of the stories about news, if we just take news as a whole, is looking at ABC in the 60s and seeing its growth into the news organization that it became.
You mentioned CBS Reports, and that really wasn't so much a magazine show as it was actually fully produced documentaries that were just being presented. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think one of the most famous ones was on Cesar Chavez and the grape picker union in
Harvest of Shame.
Right.
And that was the same vehicle, CBS Reports, that Murrow would use on occasion. But even after Murrow, as you mentioned, they have Harvest of Shame. They talk about the DDT scare and the environment. One of the first shows to begin to talk about that, and that had again an irregular run. It was always subject to preemption. It was frequently put in time slots that weren't favorable, but it was a meaty show. It was occasionally lightened up when Harry Reasoner would come on with one of his more whimsical broadcasts, and those were written by Andy Rooney, and they were solid news reporting, but Reasoner had a way about him when he was presenting things that kind of lightened the mood. On the other hand, you also had a CBS Reports called The Homosexuals, which was extremely controversial then and now. It was hosted by Mike Wallace, and Wallace, before he died, would come to say that it was one of the few shows he had done that he was actually ashamed that he had done. He said, we didn't really understand what homosexuality was at the time. We didn't understand whether it was an illness or a lifestyle choice, but it generally presented homosexuality as a threat to family culture, as something that was almost impossible to understand, that in a sense homosexuals were as alien and as foreign to the American way of life as hippies. I don't want to put that parallel too strongly because there was a lot more to it than that. But you can see why it was a controversial show at the time. And you can see why Wallace would disavow it later on. But what it goes to show is that, as you suggest, CBS Reports wasn't afraid to tackle some big topics and spend some time doing it.
Well, you also mentioned in your email you wanted to talk a bit about the Fred Friendly, Lucille Ball contretemps.
Well, yes. Now, you know, when we talked about the growing presence of the news on television, one of the things that was perhaps the most controversial about that within the networks themselves was the practice of preempting regular programming for news specials. And by that, I don't mean an assassination. I don't mean a disaster or some kind of what we would call today breaking news. I'm talking about events that would be considered newsworthy and of importance that the American public should be witness to. Now, Fred Friendly was the head of CBS News in the mid-60s, and one of the fathers of CBS Reports, as a matter of fact, and a colleague of Ed Murrow's. And the controversy between Fred Friendly and Lucille Ball took place around a congressional hearing that was going on Vietnam. And it was going to be I can't remember if it was the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense, I believe, or perhaps even the Joint Chief. But there was going to be some major testimony going on before a congressional committee on Vietnam. And this was when Vietnam was beginning to be a big story. But it wasn't yet the story it would be in the late 60s into the 70s. It wasn't a dominant story, it was just a big story. And Friendly felt very strongly that this was going to be testimony that it was important for the viewers, for the public to know about, to hear, to be able to decide for themselves what was going on in Vietnam. And he felt it important that CBS be on the air to cover that hearing on a weekday afternoon. I think NBC and ABC, either one or both of them were planning on covering it as well, and that's what he wanted to do. But the message came from the head of the network, either William Paley himself or one of his lieutenants. The message came to Friendly, we're not going to preempt our regular programming to show this. There's going to be too much of a loss of advertising money, a loss of ratings, a loss of revenue for this kind of a news story. Now, what Friendly chose to do was he singled out Lucille Ball because of the absurdity of the whole thing, that the network preferred to go with a rerun of I Love Lucy from the 50s rather than show congressional hearings on Vietnam. And Friendly resigned his position as head of CBS News in protest over this. So he took it very seriously. A lot of news people took it very seriously. But it was I think, an early sign that for all the prestige that I spoke about earlier and importance, that network news coverage was beginning to realize that it still had a ways to go, and it was still seen as something that had to give way to ratings when push came to shove, so that when there was an argument that could be made, again, an assassination, there's no argument. A disaster, there's no argument. But if there is an argument as to whether or not you could preempt a show for a news special, you were going to have quite a fight on your hands. Now, by the 70s, by the end of Vietnam and Watergate, that's not an issue. But it still is in the mid-60s.
So, the 1960s saw the rise of public television. There had been early in the 50s and early 60s what was called educational television. But public television, from what I know, generally arose post the famous comment by Newt Minow about television being a vast wasteland. And it took, I think, a handful of years from the early 60s. I think it was 1967 or 68, when public television, as we know it now, first came into being. Can you sort of chart the course there?
Yeah, that was when LBJ pushed through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and set it up as a government sponsored network that would provide programming that was in the public interest, that was educational, but also cultural. It was seen as kind of a way to furnish the programs that weren't being shown on network television. Now, again, this is an argument that goes all the way back to the founding of TV itself. And one of the great things about television, supposedly, was going to be its ability to bring cultural programming and drama and educational shows to the masses. Well, once it became solidified that television was going to be run on an advertiser supported basis and that the ratings would become an important aspect of that, the idea that networks were committed to showing this kind of programming on a regular basis kind of dropped off. You had NBC Opera Theater, which was able to limp along into the mid 60s, but it was seldom able to find any sponsorship, so it wound up being supported by the network itself. You had drama that was giving away to other kinds of programming. When Minnow makes his speech, he's really looking at what he sees as the degeneration of the quality of regular programming on television in favor of lowest common denominator, mindless entertainment type of programming. And you can debate what that includes, but that was the gauntlet that he threw down. Public broadcasting was supposed to step in and serve that kind of a need, to have the shows that weren't on television that should be, to be able to create new kinds of television shows, television that explored different aspects of culture, of the news, of entertainment in a new and different way, to present provocative programming. One of the shows that they did, the title of it escapes me, but it was a play that had an all-black cast dressed in whiteface. And that was an explosively controversial idea. A network never would have touched that. But that's the kind of program that public television was dedicated at the outset to try and present. Serious topical dramas mixed with cultural programs, mixed with educational programs, civic, informational, religious programs. That was kind of what it was supposed to be. But there are some signs that from the very beginning of that, there was already an indication that it wasn't going to work the way they had hoped. And one of the examples that I always enjoy relating was the outgrowth of what came to be Masterpiece Theater. Now, Masterpiece Theater is maybe one of the most famous programs in the history of public broadcasting. It wasn't there at the outset, but from the beginning, National Education Television, which is what it was called prior to taking on PBS, from the beginning, NET had a supply of programming from Britain that they would show on a regular basis. So even though it might go under the title of NET Playhouse or NET Opera Theater, many of the shows had originally aired on the BBC or on some other forms of broadcasting. And I'm not talking about the kind of shows that we would see in the British invasion later on that were popping up on PBS all the time, detective stories or comedies or things like that. These were more of the kinds of special programs or miniseries. And so what happened was at a very early point in time, NET started to become dependent on this kind of programming. They would have these miniseries, we would call them. They had the Forsyte Saga. They had the First Churchills. There were a number of multi-part dramas
Upstairs,
that they would
downstairs.
present. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then
that they would.
And then
they
I
would
think
present.
wasn't Caligula also No, not Caligula.
Claudius.
I Claudius.
Yep.
Caligula.
Yes. Well, yeah. Caligula's on a different
Yeah.
public access station, but yeah, that all came out. That is what morphed into Masterpiece Theater. But what it did at the same time, if you look at some of the conversations that are going on within the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and within the stations who are part of public broadcasting, one of the controversies is that a lot of these stations are starting to say, you're selling out to British programming at the cost of developing homegrown drama that can be shown on television. We should be looking more at developing our own programming rather than taking our inventory from overseas. And so one of the harshest critics of public broadcasting was the public broadcasting station in St. Paul, Minneapolis, Minnesota, my hometown, KTCA. They were one of the last holdouts to join NET and PBS formally as an affiliate. They would show a lot of their programs, but they also depended on a lot of their own programs, and they probably stuck more closely to the original mission of showing educational programming, even in prime time, than the other stations did. And at the time, what KTCA had objected strongly to was some of the political content that they saw coming through on PBS, which they saw as being slanted to the left, as being slanted against the administration. And I don't know that their problem was so much with it having a left-wing slant as the idea that it was slanted at all, that they believed strongly. Schwartzwalder, who is the number 2 man at KTCA, John Schwartzwalder, believed that they were alienating their potential audience and they were antagonizing Congress, who was responsible, after all, for the funding that the network would have. They were antagonizing these people needlessly by showing this kind of programming when they should be showing something that was not lightweight, but wasn't so aggressively partisan one way or the other. So even from the beginning of PBS's development, you had this kind of controversy. Now, we know the rest of the story, which is that PBS wound up being in the targets of a lot of politicians, and its budget would be cut back. Therefore, it would become more dependent on viewer contributions and on corporate contributions than any kind of public funding. As it became more dependent on these other sources of funding, it became more important for them to program shows that would deliver ratings. So they become subject to the exact same pressures that the networks did, that they have to have shows that are going to be popular, that are going to draw an audience, that donors are going to watch and contribute to keep them on the air. And so, opera disappears from PBS. Modern dance disappears from PBS. A lot of serious documentaries disappear from PBS. A lot of them remain, but you have shows that are really, a lot of them are not so different from what you'd see on the network. You have shows that continue to take a left political look at things, and you see them getting further and further away from what their original mission was. Now, there are writers and there are books that would argue that from the very beginning PBS was doomed to something like this. Don't know if that's true or not, but what it does show was that PBS, or more broadly, public broadcasting was never a concrete thing. It was always an idea, a concept, and it never solidified into what they really could do. It wasn't even a network for the longest time. They had all these shows, but as an affiliate, you weren't required to show all of them, and even if you did show them all, you weren't required to show them at the same time. Now, some of them were, but some of them weren't, and stations would augment the shows with their own programs, and some of them were imports and some of them were locally produced. But somebody said once that keeping PBS as a functioning network was like trying to herd cats. You had all these stations that wanted to go their own way, and it was. Yeah, I don't know that it was never practical, but they never really did have an idea that concretely was able to be put into practice. That's too bad, but I think PBS has probably abrogated its original responsibility as the Johnson administration would have seen it, as the original heads of the CPB would have. I think they would be as disappointed as anybody to see what PBS has become today, even though in many respects it's probably one of the better networks on TV.
Yeah, I mean, I remember as a kid seeing the original Doctor Who there. Even into the mid to late 80s, they would have quality from other countries like the Anne of Green Gables miniseries. But I want to talk just briefly then about the two pillars of children's television on there. One being the obvious one, Sesame Street, and the other one I think started, I'm not sure if Fred Rogers preceded PBS on network television and whatnot, but he soon joined public television if he wasn't there in the beginning, and he was one of the biggest supporters for the funding of it. So if you could just briefly talk about both of those iconic shows.
Yeah, Sesame Street was quite a revolution when it first started, and that nobody had really seen anything like it. And it was controversial from the very beginning as well. There were people who talked about it being too fast paced, that it was going to stunt childhood development because of its fast pace. Not just that there was a lot going on, because we know that there was a lot going on on Howdy Doody as well. But the idea of quick cuts, of repetitive lessons, of different kinds of things that concerned a lot of its critics. But the critics were mostly in the minority. It was wildly popular from most people when it began, and it began with that fanfare. And it proved to be a real pillar of PBS going forward. It was one of the flagship shows when they would argue for increased funding was you want to keep Sesame Street. Now, the other show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, I think that probably started before Sesame Street, but it didn't get on the network until later on. I could be wrong about that, but because you can see, Mr. Rogers started in Canada, then it evolved into being on PBS. Fred Rogers had done the show from Pittsburgh, and it was originally on CBC, and then it made it to PBS. Now, talking about its importance to the growth of public broadcasting, one of the reasons for that is because Fred Rogers went to Congress and talked about it at a time when Congress was very anti-PBS funding, and there was a lot of talk about cutting funding for the network, even eliminating it. And he went to testify before Congress and almost single-handedly, I don't think we're giving him too much credit for that, almost single-handedly put on a demonstration in his testimony to Congress that swayed their minds and turned them back toward seeing the importance of keeping a show like that on public broadcasting. So he was marketed in a way as the opposite of Sesame Street, whereas Sesame Street was this lightning pace, quick cuts, loud show with all the Muppets. Mr. Rogers was calm, slow, paternal, friendly, whatever kind of adjectives you want to use, but he was the antithesis of what Sesame Street was. And some people thought that that was a good idea. Some people thought that it wasn't. Um, but it was gentle, and that's what Sesame Street was not. When you look at what happened, one of his most famous programs was in the wake of the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. He went on the air on PBS with a prime time special, not daytime, not in his regular spot, but a prime time special, talking to parents about how their children should talk, or how they should talk to their children about what had happened. And there's a powerful moment within that special that they have clips of where one of the puppets, I think it's Daniel Striped Tiger, talking to one of the humans on the show, and he asks her, "What's assassination mean?" And Mr. Rogers talked about how children were undoubtedly afraid of what had gone on. They were very shaken by the reaction they had seen from their parents. It might have been the first time many of them had ever seen their parents afraid or worried or crying themselves. And that he said, I want to help you discuss how you should talk about this with your children. So he was the man that you would go to for a special like that. He did another special after 9/11 that was similar in tone and in content. So he was the flip side of Sesame Street. But I think Fred Rogers was not to belabor the point, but he was very important in keeping the funding for PBS going.
Well, I want to just challenge the claim that Sesame Street was sort of raucous. I recently watched a YouTube video where a guy did about an overview of Sesame Street from the 60s and 70s till now. And now I just found out a couple of weeks ago Sesame Street isn't even on PBS anymore.
Right.
It's on Nickelodeon. And it all centered around Elmo, who became a star in the 80s, but I guess the character was first conceived in the late 70s. And he showed convincingly, I thought, that Sesame Street in the beginning was very calm. You'd often have the people gather in the center, and it would be the adults just simply talking about, "Hi, Bob, it's a nice day. Yes, the weather." I mean, pretty dull stuff. The script, but also, yes, you'd have Oscar the Grouch, and yes, you'd have Cookie Monster and whatnot. But you'd also have these little films that might just show the ocean coming in for 2 minutes with no words. Or I remember my favorite film, and I remember this from being 5 or 6 years old when it first came on, a Vivaldi guitar concerto.
Yes, where I first heard it too.
Called The Weeping Flower. And so you would have these filmic, experimental little films. You would have, before you have the count, counting, you'd have just maybe a Muppet there. 1, 2, and you'd get go through the alphabet. So but as the show went on, after the death of the old man, the shopkeeper,
Mr. Hooper.
Yeah, Mr. Hooper. In the late 70s, though, by the 80s, the Reagan era, I think that's where a lot of people get the idea that it got raucous. Because I think if you really look in the beginning, this guy showed some of the early clips from the 60s and 70s. It was a much more subdued and much more, if you want to call now, safe environment than the so-called safe environment. And this guy pinned it on Elmo, but anyway, I just wanted to throw that out to you.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I think it's a good point. While you were talking about that, I pulled up one of the articles I had about Sesame Street from a contemporary article from the time. This is from 1970, and this is an educational consultant speaking at a conference of the American Management Association, and he's talking about Sesame Street on the occasion of its second anniversary. So at this point, it's still in its infancy. Even though we're in 1970, we're still talking about the show as it was in the 60s. Arnold called the program a failure and quoted a number of other authorities who agree with his opinion. One of those who agreed with him elaborated, saying that Sesame Street is not imagination. It is more accurately labeled as fraudulent. For example, while children from poverty homes did know their numbers, they didn't know what they meant. They couldn't relate to the numeral 3. They couldn't relate the numeral 3 to a group of 3 apples. This type of learning is equivalent to that achieved by a fairly bright parrot. And there's another one talking about that the show presenting an unrealistic view of life. A Cornell psychologist complains that Sesame Street is part of a dream world with no racial tensions. Nobody ever gets mad. No sharp words are spoken. How, he wonders, does this prepare children for real life? A school principal says that the show makes no demands on the kids. Real school and real life aren't like that. If a problem is troubling you, you can't just switch it off and walk away. So, I'm not saying this to disagree with your premise. I'm simply pointing it out that the show was controversial from the very outset, even though this same article that I'm reading from goes on to say that the show has 10 times as many fans as it has detractors, and they point to the increases in scores among disadvantaged children as evidence of its ability to be able to make an impact. So I think that people have strong opinions on it one way or the other, but the idea that it was without controversy, I think, is probably wishful thinking. You know, it's rose-colored glasses to say that it was never controversial, just as it is myopic to say that the show was nothing but a PR-fueled stunt to attract more funding for PBS. Those are extremes on both sides, and they're both wrong.
Let us turn then to, you wanted to speak a bit about some of the social relevance that came into television. You mentioned shows like The Defenders, which had Mike Brady, Mr. Novak, Room 222, which was a light comedy that was one of the first to show integration as, I guess most people would want to think of it. You mentioned something called The Final War of Ollie Winter. And you didn't mention one thing you didn't mention. Diane Carroll also had the first sitcom headed by a female, and I think it was only the second show with a black lead after Nat King Cole's variety show 15 years earlier.
Yeah, there was an old sitcom called Beulah that it was actually a carryover from the radio, and I think Ethel Waters had played Beulah
and
at
Amos
one point
and Andy,
in time.
but the less said about those two for modern
we're
audiences.
talking about in the more modern era of television. Well, again, I'm not going to sit here and just read from my blog here for an hour, but there is something that I think is good to talk about here. I'm looking at an issue of TV Guide from September of 1965 that is making public the conflict that's going on in television about the content of programming and the difficulty in getting adult topics on shows. Issue dramas, they call them, and the dramas that were known for tackling topical, controversial issues and advocating for unpopular causes. And the focus of the discussion in TV Guide was based on where this serious drama had gone and why. And so you have Bruce Geller, who created Mannix and Mission Impossible. And he complained that one of the problems with television, this is a very interesting critique, one of the problems with television was that networks were concerned about bringing in black characters, but that writers did not have the freedom to make a black character the villain. That they still needed to be stereotyped as either a hero or as a respectable member of society because it was more important to transmit that message. And so he was complaining that the one time that he tried to introduce a black character as a villain, he had to change him to an Argentinian. He said, I guess there's no Argentine pressure group around. But Mr. Novak is another case where you're talking about education. You're talking about a teacher and students. And certainly this is an area that's ripe for discussions on the problems that young people face and how teachers can become involved in the process for them to be able to evolve and learn and turn into responsible adults. And Jack Newman, who worked a lot with Mr. Novak, says that the network is putting pressure on writers to eliminate sex and violence from drama. This is 1965, so this is before this country has hit the peak of violence that we'd see later in the decade. He's saying these dictums to eliminate sex and violence from drama are destroying drama. Sex is the driving force of every man and woman in the country. Anyone who tells me to take violence out of drama, I say go to hell. And then he's joined by Gene Roddenberry, and this is the pre-Star Trek Roddenberry, but he'd still done a lot of writing for television, including shows like Have Gun Will Travel, where he tended to insert a social if not a social message, at least a social consciousness into some of the storylines. And he points out that conflict is the source of drama. And if the conflict doesn't come from the subject matter, it's inevitably going to come from something more physical. So you've got it either way. It's got to come from society about some kind of an issue, or it's got to come from something that's going to turn violent. But if you eliminate the sources of conflict, then you eliminate the conflict. And if you eliminate the conflict, you eliminate the drama. So you come to a show like The Defenders, for example, which was a highly praised legal drama that was kind of, I don't want to say it was the anti-Perry Mason, but in a way it was, because Perry Mason handles only murder cases. They always culminate in a courtroom drama, and the drama almost always culminates in a scene where Perry's able to confront the accused, or confront the real killer, who will usually stand up and scream something about, I did it and I'm glad I did it. And then they fade out. But the Defenders took a different approach. They were tackling issues that did not necessarily wind up in murder cases. Sometimes they didn't even wind up in court. They would talk about things like abortion and prostitution and censorship and blacklisting and things that are very legal. They're very much the kind of thing that lawyers confront, but they're issues that aren't usually addressed in public. At least not on television. Can you prevent somebody from speaking in a school if they're speaking on a topic that you decide is anti-American? Well, who decides what's anti-American? Is it anti-American to speak out against the government? Is it against freedom of speech to speak out against the government? And is that a bad thing? You had this wave of shows that would tackle these kinds of issues. There was another legal program called Sam Benedict with Edmund O'Brien. Really good show. Lasted only 1 year, and I wish it had been on longer. But it tackled the same kinds of things. Could you defend a communist? Could you defend a Nazi? Was it okay to defend one but not the other? These very complex issues. And these legal dramas didn't always provide you with an easy solution either. There was another show that came on in the late 60s called Judd for the Defense, which I really like. It's one of my favorite shows, and it was only on for a couple of years. But it was an excellent show, and it not only presented these controversial issues, but it did it in kind of an ambiguous way, where sometimes Judd uh, would be defending a client he didn't like. He didn't agree with him, but he felt that it was important for that client to receive his constitutional defense, because that's what the nation was founded on. And so he would be put in a position where he would sometimes change his mind about something. Other times he would never change his mind. He would still not like his client, but he would, as the old saying goes, I disagree with you, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And so, and another thing about Judd was that you didn't always find out how the case was going to end. There were 2 or 3 trials that Judd went through where the episode ends before the verdict. You don't know if his client is convicted or acquitted. And it's because that isn't really what the show was about. If you look at the episodes in question, you had people dealing with complex issues, either complex personal issues or complex legal issues or complex cultural issues. And sometimes the point of the show isn't to determine guilt or innocence, it's to get those issues out in the open. Sometimes it is to see the defendant work through his own issues and come to some kind of a conclusion about himself. Sometimes he's being forced to confront the truth. Sometimes we're seeing that there are 2 sides to the same story. But the bottom line is that you don't get a resolution to the legal drama, and that's because that's not what the episode was about. It was about something different. So you get these kinds of shows that are the antithesis of what we've become used to on television. And that's very much a part of this drive for social relevance, this idea that there are big ideas and big issues out there, and that they're very controversial, but you don't have to feel strongly one way or the other about it to concede that it should be aired out, that we should be mature enough to talk about things like abortion or unmarried mothers or teen pregnancies or suicide, that we should be able to talk about them like rational adults instead of having the networks say that this kind of topic should be taboo on television. Judd for the defense, by the way, I wanted to mention in case I've interested anybody in it. Judd was played by Carl Betts, who's best known as the husband in the Donna Reed show, and as a light comedian, but he was a classically trained actor. And it was a shock, I think, to people to find out that Carl Betts was capable of the kind of drama that you saw in Judd for the Defense. That's another reason why it's a favorite show of mine. But it's an example of this maturation, I would say, of television to where it was willing to tackle issues like that. There's a scene in Room 222 you were talking about where Karen Valentine asks Lloyd Haynes, I think it was, she said, kind of what she's trying to say is, forgive me if I'm awkward. I'm not used to being around black people. And the way she says it is, I went to an integrated school. And he says, don't worry, I did too. And so that's, 222 tackled the serious issues, but that was an example of a show, and I think Julia was too, to a certain extent, where they tried to leaven it a little bit with some humor, but at the same time to make those points without being strident about it.
Well, I think I wanted to talk about Room 222 because it was one of my favorite shows as a kid, and I actually watched in the last couple of months 7 or 8 episodes. I don't think it holds up as well as it should. I think it's still quality for its day, but one of the things, just looking back on it, Lloyd Haynes was sort of the Sidney Poitier of television. Yep. He was Mr. Perfect. He always had the answer. And then was it Denise Nicholas who was the?
Yes.
Yeah,
Hmm.
she was gorgeous and saintly. And I'm also thinking then of the Mod Squad though, as
Hmm.
the
Clarence
count
Williams.
a
Yeah.
counterpoint. Clarence Williams was the closest you could get to an edgy black character without making him a villain, because I believe he was a drug dealer as a teenager, and they rehabilitated him, and he became a cop and whatnot. And then you had what was her name, Julie Lipton. Uh,
Yeah. Hmm.
Peggy Lipton. Peggy Lipton
Peggy
was
Lipton.
the
Yes.
actress. Julie was the character, and she was though the typical damsel in distress. And so it seemed, although they had the right ideas, they just couldn't in these shows. I mean, like I said, Denise Nicholas was a saint. Peggy Lipton was the damsel in distress virtually every episode. So when we're talking about sex and race, they were going in the right direction, but
Hmm.
looking back at those shows, you still see how far they had to go.
Well, another example of that is Don Mitchell in Ironside.
Mm.
Don Mitchell was presented as a character who was headed for a bad life. He'd already had trouble in the law with the law. He'd already done things. When Ironside picks him out to be part of his team, it's kind of like you've got a choice. You're going to work for me, or you're going to be facing a life in jail or dead on the streets. And Mitchell is Mark Sanger, I think was his character's name. There's a real latent hostility in him that sometimes comes out in the open, but this the resentment of the man, a resentment of the system, and Ironside tries to impress upon him the idea that you can't change things when you're in jail. You can't change things if you're dead. You don't have to become part of the cogs of the system, but if you want to change the system, you've got to be in the system. And it may be a little idealistic, a lot idealistic, and it may be a situation where what you're really doing is playing to the strength of the hero of Ironside as the great white father. And I'm not making that argument. I think some people would, but it's not an argument I've heard a lot. My point is that there are stereotypes about this you could look at where Ironside is cast in the role of the man who's reforming Mitchell, Mark Sanger. But his was a character that was written so that you saw him as a man who was angry, but he still had great intelligence, a burning passion for life and for justice and for things that were important, and a desire to do something about it. So what Ironside is really doing is working with him to channel and funnel all of that energy into something productive instead of something destructive. At that point, it becomes a political question, whether, just as what was facing the black community at the time. Do you work within the system, or do you tear down the system? But it's no longer a question, I think, of Sanger being the prototypical subservient black who's healed by the great white father and turned into something that he wasn't. It was always there. And that's why his character was one of the best that I think written about at that time.
And you mentioned also Ivan Dixon in something called The
Yes.
Final War While I Winter. Now, I know Ivan Dixon. That was the black fellow from Hogan's Heroes, right?
Yep. Who actually probably was the smartest one in the whole bunch, except for Hogan himself. We could get off on a whole nother topic about Ivan Dixon's character, Sergeant Kinchlow, and the relationship he has to Hogan, and that it is, in fact, a very mature handling of race. But that's a topic for another day. The point that I wanted to make was that Dixon was also a very serious actor, and an actor who had great dramatic credentials. He'd been in The Twilight Zone. He'd been in other episodes. I think he was in an episode of The Fugitive. He'd been in other episodes of serious shows. He wanted to get into directing, which was why he left Hogan's Heroes in the first place. But Ollie Winter was a very interesting drama, a play. It was one of these dramatic idea type shows that we've been talking about that writers and producers were fighting to get on television. He was a soldier. His last war was going to be as an advisor in Vietnam. And so part of it goes through that aspect of it, the whole question about Vietnam as it's beginning again to become an issue. We're catching these things in the middle, and I love that kind of thing when you're catching that, but when you're seeing it in its evolutionary stage. But it was one of the few dramas that has a black lead in it, that is tackling something like Vietnam, and that is looking at a black man going through this racial transformation, where he's attacked by the Viet Cong. He's able to get back to safety. He has a young Vietnamese girl as his companion, but he's able to talk about what it means to be a black man, what it means to be a professional soldier, what it means to be here in Vietnam and getting out of Vietnam, and hopefully getting out alive. And it was a controversial enough show that there were a number of CBS affiliates that refused to carry it. It was aired in 1967, so things are beginning to fire up, and whether they're not carrying it because of the racial aspect of it, or because they're talking about the war, it's a controversial show. But I like to look at it as a show that is worthy to be studied, because it's a serious show covering serious issues with a black man as the lead and Vietnam as the background. And that's the kind of thing you didn't get a lot of.
I forget whether it was in a private conversation or in one of our earlier shows, but I'd mentioned the actor Frank Converse in a show called Coronet Blue, which was very much in the prisoner vein. And you would want to talk about the show that he did after that. And in fact, the odd thing was, because Converse got the show NYPD, he couldn't go back to do a second season of Coronet Blue, because they had already moved on. But that starred Robert Hooks, another black actor from the 60s, Jack Warden, a veteran of television for 20 years by that point. And I know this was considered at the time. They had NYPD Blue like 15 years later or whatnot, Hill Street Blues, and then NYPD Blue 20 years maybe later. But NYPD was another one of these shows that made sort of a historical point in terms of the grittiness of the time versus, say, the just the facts man Joe Friday approach to things. So talk a bit about that show.
Well, New York is a big character in police shows that are set in New York, and it's actually one of the members of the cast, I think. When you take a look at one of the great dramatic shows from the past, Naked City, which was set in New York, you saw a New York in that was starting to decay. We'd all seen the New York of the Broadway musicals and the New York of Times Square and everything. Now we were starting to catch New York as it was starting to get grittier and grimier. It wasn't all the way there yet, but it was starting to get there. By NYPD, we've got New York in full fall. It's a rough, tough city. There's a lot of porn out there. There's a lot of crooks out there. There are a lot of nasty things going on. And so you're right. David Susskind was the executive producer of it, and it brought a grittiness to the crime series, the police series, that you didn't see much of. But I think in talking about it where we are, one of the significant things about it is how Hooks' character comes across in this show. He is not, I would say, he is not a black detective. He is a detective who happens to be black. And when something happens on the force, when he has some kind of an accusation come up against him that he'd taken bribes or that he'd used excessive force, something like that, Jack Warden is the boss, and Hooks and Converse are the two detectives that work under him. And the immediate assumption is that and I don't mean this to sound like the police always look after their own, but the point is they don't view Hooks as a black man being accused of these things. They look at him in a completely colorblind manner. He's one of them. And I think that is a significant way to look at it. They're not sugarcoating him. It's not a case, as Bruce Geller was pointing out earlier, about having to present a saintly man. Hooks has as many problems as Converse. He has as many problems as any detective on the force has. But for the most part, the racial aspect of it isn't an issue. What is an issue is that he's a policeman. And I think it's a mature presentation of this. You don't see any of the talking behind the scenes where his fellow cops may say one thing to him but another thing behind his back. He's been fully, completely, totally accepted by his colleagues in the force, the men he works with, and they don't see his color when they look at him. They see a man whose back they've got and who's got their back. And that was besides the fact that Hooks is a terrific actor. He was actually, I believe, the producer of that NET drama that had the black cast in whiteface that I was talking about earlier. He was involved in that show as well. So I think, I could be wrong about that, and forgive me if I am, because sometimes all the names just jump together. But he was a very good actor, and I think that you see that in this performance, that he could have been any color, any race, any ethnic background. Before he was anything else, he was a policeman. And I think that's a mature way to look at it that television didn't necessarily look at back then.
I was just looking up because I wanted to talk not about Robert Hooks, but his son, Kevin Hooks.
Kevin, yes.
Who later became a director, who's probably most known for his role in The White Shadow as Morris Thorpe. But there were two Christmas specials that really stood out to me, non-cartoon specials, as a child. One was in 1971, The Homecoming, that starred the Waltons, and I'm sure we'll talk about the Waltons when we hit the next decade. But the other one is one that's almost totally forgotten to time, and it's called JT, where Kevin Hooks played a young inner-city black kid who has his family is falling apart, and he's taking care of this sickly alley cat that he finds. And it really hit home for me, because I would have been 4 at the time, and I didn't have pets. We couldn't have pets when I was a kid, so I was friendly with all the alley cats in my neighborhood. I would recommend it. I don't know if have you ever seen that?
Yes, I have. And you're absolutely right in everything you say about it. As a matter of fact, I just ran across it in TV Guide this afternoon. Before we went on the air, I was looking over the issue that I'm going to be writing about next week on the blog, and its premiere was in this issue. And it is a charming show. It is heartfelt without being either mawkish or sentimental, and it doesn't sugarcoat what it's like growing up in the ghetto, in the griminess of everything. But this very gentle relationship between this sensitive young boy and this cat is you're right. It should have become an annual presentation on TV, and I'm not sure why it didn't, and I'm not sure why it isn't out today in some form. Maybe it is, I don't know, but it should be out. It should be available if it isn't. You can find it on YouTube, but it is touching, moving, without being mawkish, without being saccharine, and he just is wonderful in that.
Yeah, one other one came to mind, and I don't know what year it was, but it had Jason Robards, The House Without a Christmas Tree. That was another one that impacted me. I think that was 70 or 71, though.
Yeah.
But so we can get to that along with the Waltons. But one of the reasons that it did stick with me was because when people say inner city, they usually use it as slang to mean black or sometimes
Hmm.
Hispanic. But I was a white kid who grew up in the inner city, and there are plenty of what you would call poor working class whites
Oh
whose
yeah.
lives are far more similar to JT or the later Cosby kids. Put
Hmm.
aside the rape charges and whatnot. This is when Bill Cosby was still a seeming upstanding citizen. But those are one of the few shows that showed what it was like to live in the burned out, decaying ruins of a
Hmm.
megalopolis.
Yeah, that when a city starts to collapse like that, it doesn't care what color you are. It only cares that you happen to be there when it's collapsing.
So I know probably the most famous early television, made for television movie that still rings a bell in people's names would be Brian's Song, which I think came on in '71 with James Caan and Billy D. Williams. Uh, but but those television movies started a few years earlier. You'd have the NBC Wednesday night movie of the week or whatever it might have been.
Hmm.
How did they get started? Now we'll talk about miniseries when we get to the '70s
Sure.
too, but the late '60s was basically the breeding ground for made for television movies.
Yeah. Well, as studios became more involved in television and they became more involved in the creation of series, I think it was probably natural that at some point they would start to develop longer form programming. And by that, what I mean is that the initial made for TV movies generally ran for 90 minutes. They weren't 2 hours, but they were telling stories that didn't have a regular cast of regulars. And it didn't have it had a story that was perhaps too big to fit into 60 minutes, but it wasn't big enough to fit into 2 hours. So the very definition of a TV movie has evolved. But these first TV movies were it was obvious it was going to happen sooner or later. Now, the first movie that was supposed to be the first made for TV movie was called The Killers. It was a remake of the late 40s noir movie that had Edmund O'Brien and Burt Lancaster in it. And it's based on a short story by Ernest Hemingway. And The Killers starred Lee Marvin, Ronald Reagan, and Angie Dickinson. And when the finished product, the network, NBC, concluded that it was too violent for television. Now, it isn't. I don't think it is. It certainly isn't today. But there's a scene. There's a scene where Ronald Reagan belts Angie Dickinson, and I can see where Reagan always said that this was his last movie before he went into politics, and it was the only time he ever played a bad guy, and he said that he hated that scene. He always regretted having done that scene, but it did deal with some issues of the time. But anyway, the network said this is too violent. We can't show this, and so The Killers went into theaters instead. So that meant that the first made-for-TV movie would be in 1964, toward the end of 1964. And it's generally thought that there was a movie called See How They Run that became the first TV movie. But you're correct that this is something that came along in the 60s and evolved through the decade. Probably one of the most famous and most loved aspects of TV movies was when ABC started its series called The Movie of the Week, and it was the first movie show that was devoted exclusively to movies made for television. World premiere movies, as they would call them. You'd see them for the first time anywhere. And rather than just the occasional made for TV movie, this was, an entire series with them. And people loved them. Some of them were huge hits. Many of them were pilots for future ABC shows, like I'm thinking that the Night Stalker
Yeah.
was on Movie of the Week. Many of the shows that you would see come to pass on ABC started out as movies of the week. Duel the great movie with Dennis Weaver that Steven Spielberg directed, was a movie of the week. Um,
Well,
and
I think the first Columbo episode or first
yeah,
well, that was a
it
movie,
was.
and
Uh,
I think the first one actually didn't have Falk. It was 2 or 3 years before, and Falk was actually the second Columbo, I
Yeah,
believe.
yeah. It was called Prescription Murder, and it
Yeah,
appeared on, I think, like the Kraft Mystery Theater
yeah.
or what. And that, you're right. It was a stage play. Levinson and Lincoln created it as a stage play, and it made its transition to the screen. And that was the. I'm trying to remember who played Columbo in that. It was. Let me just take a look, because this is going to bother me. Until I wake up in the middle of the night when it's too late for us to do anything about it. Anyway, the point is that that what did start out as a TV movie. It wasn't even a pilot. It was just a TV movie. And Bert Freed was the actor who played Columbo, who usually plays bad guys, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
But having seen this episode, he's very good in it. But you're right, Columbo was just the prescription murder was or dying. Yeah, prescription murder was just a movie. It wasn't a pilot. It wasn't until the movie did well that they decided to do a second Columbo movie that did become the pilot, and that was what the series was based on. But that was the popularity of these made-for-TV movies, is spawning these different series.
So, before we head towards, because we've talked about a lot of things that people don't associate with as 1960s television, and we'll get to that in a bit. But I do want to just pause for one moment and ask you just a question. We talked about earlier about ABC being the third network, and
Hmm.
NBC was NBC. CBS, though, in the 1960s, and I think it was right around the time of Newt Minow, the FCC chairman's comment about the vast wasteland, got the reputation and the moniker. I don't know if it was who applied it as the Tiffany Network.
Yeah,
What did
yeah.
that mean, and why was that applied to CBS?
Well, CBS was always thought of, especially when Bill Paley was the head of the network. It was called the Tiffany Network because it was the network of quality. And quality in the people who appeared on it, quality in the programming that it showed. And the specials, the news department, all these different things that went into their programming um, justified Tiffany. CBS's reputation as the Tiffany Network was because of the high quality of their programming, not just their regular series, but their dramas, the big name Hollywood movies that they would show, their news department, uh, their cultural programming. All of this really showcased the talent that they had at the network. And so they had gotten the reputation as being the Tiffany Network. And when you were mentioning Newton Minow and of course his vast wasteland speech, which I think is um, debatable. I know we've talked about that before. I think television was better than he made it out to be. But I think one of the reasons why that made such an impact was because you had a show like the Beverly Hillbillies, which was the most popular show on television. It was regularly attracting an audience of maybe 60% of all the televisions that were in use at the time. The Beverly Hillbillies and the shows that followed that were in that vein were on CBS. And this kind of came as a crushing rebuke, if you will, to the network's moniker as being the Tiffany Network. The Tiffany all of a sudden wasn't quite as shiny as it used to be, and so that's why I think you saw part of that reaction. I doubt that if the Beverly Hillbillies had been on ABC, I doubt it would have raised that much of a furor as being lowest common denominator programming. Now, it It wasn't. We've talked about that. It wasn't lowest common denominator programming, but it gets that rap for being programming that pandered to the audience as just entertainment. It's an unfair criticism, but the fact that a show like that made it to CBS was big, and that other shows like that would follow was significant. So I think that was all related. The idea of the Tiffany Network and the idea of these programs. Just to go back to ABC, because we had been talking about that, ABC doesn't have much going for it. Again, it's a small network. It doesn't have clearance, and it doesn't have a lot of successful shows. What this did enable ABC to do was take chances on programs that were unconventional, programs that might not have made it on other networks. They had nothing to lose. And so they had a show like The Fugitive, which we all remember as great drama, but which was very controversial at the time because it presented the idea that the American justice system could falsely convict somebody.
Yeah.
It had a show like Combat, which was really gritty war drama type of thing. They didn't get a #1 show of their own until Bewitched. They didn't get a #1 series for the entire season until Marcus Welby, MD. So by the end of the 60s, and ABC has made a big comeback, big strides, and it wasn't even a comeback. They had no place to come back from. But ABC was starting to establish itself as a genuine network and a contender and a home of some pretty good programming that it hadn't been considered as at the beginning of the decade. It had some, but it didn't have the kind of impact that it would have by the end of the decade.
So let's talk about the obvious thing I think people most associate with the '60s, and that's actually I would think what was called high concept sitcoms. And you mentioned hillbillies getting rich and living in L.A. Things like Gilligan's Island. A bunch of people lost in a very America's version of what I call Samuel Beckett. Bewitched. We mentioned Bewitched. Guy marries a witch. Then we get I Dream of Jeannie. Well, let's top the witch with a genie. You get the monkey as the prefab four. You have Batman in all of his day glory. Car 54, Where Are You? Well, that I don't know if that was so much high concept as maybe My Mother the Car or My Favorite Martian. And so a lot of these are kind of slagged on, and I would make a case that something like Gilligan's Island, Bewitched had its moments. I think the Monkees was very. Frankly, I think the Monkees were a lot better at comedy than the Beatles were. Batman, it works for kids, but then you go back, watch it 15, 20 years later, and it still works for adults with the risque humor of the time. Talk to me about where this idea of high concept sitcoms came from, where the term came from, and why I feel, and I don't know if you do, if they're slagged on much more than they should be.
Well, I think the last point first. You're right that people pick on them because they don't appeal to the intellect necessarily. Although they're much smarter shows than, as you pointed out, than a lot of people.
Oh, the Addams Family, is a good example.
Yeah, and the Munsters. I mean, as far as being a concept comedy, but Green Acres, which was really a satire in many ways, has some very sharp and pointed humor in it. I think that I don't know where the term came from or where it. What you might consider the first one, but it was apparent fairly early on when you start to look at the new programs every year. Not when they appear on the schedule, but when you read about them in TV Guide or in the industry publications, when they begin talking about the pilots that are being considered for coming seasons. It becomes apparent fairly early on that concept shows are really in. Once you've had one of them that has succeeded, then you have all kinds of them coming along. You have the fish out of water. You have the unlikely rich person. And I think you could connect the Beverly Hillbillies with a really bad sitcom called The Pruitts of Southampton, which was renamed The Phyllis Diller Show. But that was a sitcom that involved a family that was supposed to be very wealthy. The Pruitts were, and Phyllis Diller was the Pruitt, and the concept was that it was an incredibly wealthy family. But when the IRS dug into things, they found out that the family was almost broke. But rather than punish them, because the IRS, and get this for a concept, the IRS feared that news that the Pruitts were nearly bankrupt might cause a crash in the U.S. economy. And so they took pity on the Pruitts and allowed them to keep their property, their mansion, but to try to rein in the spending and try to make things a little more beneficial, I suppose you would use it. That's a concept that's almost like My Mother the Car, I think. But you can look at this rich person as a hillbilly as a rich person, broke person as a rich person. It's a concept, and it's a similar type of concept, fish out of water. And all of these started to catch on. And it's like anything in Hollywood: is success breeds excess. For every successful show like this, for every successful high concept show, you had a dozen imitators, many of which never even made it to the networks, but those that did didn't do very well. Even within genres, you developed subgenres that were concept shows. You had a Western, a very good Western actually, on ABC called The Outcasts. And that was a concept show because it featured a black man and a white man as cowboys working together in the post-Civil War days. I think they were bounty hunters, but they worked as a team, albeit somewhat reluctantly. That's a concept show. That's really kind of like the Defiant Ones in the Old West. So you have other shows that become sort of concepts. You have, even into the 70s, you have Cannon with William Conrad. Big man, fat man as a detective. That's kind of a concept. Barnaby Jones, senior citizen as a detective. That's kind of a concept. So within your genres of mysteries, comedies, drama, that kind of thing, you got these subgenres of concept shows, and some of them were more successful than others. I think a show like I Dream of Jeannie, for example, is very successful, certainly creates two huge stars in Barbara Eden and Larry Hagman. But what these suggested at the time, the thought was that what these suggested was a desire by viewers to escape what was going on in the real world, where there were a lot of heavy pressures, and they wanted a show that not only was not taxing. It wasn't a show like The Defenders where they were forced to think and to confront ideas. These were shows that were pure escapism. And the critics who have more than a touch of elitism, ivory tower elitism to them, the critics look at this and they think that these shows are terrible. They're demeaning. They're the phrase I always use, lowest common denominator programming, that they pander to blue class audiences, blue collar audiences, to people who just want to sit and vegetate on the couch, who don't want to be confronted by provocative themes or things like that. That really is, I think, a very elitist attitude. And you look at a number of writers in the revisionist world, and there were revisionist historians even at the time who would talk about the Beverly Hillbillies and relate to them that what the show was about as much as anything was the simple innocence of a certain class of person who could not be corrupted by wealth, who could not be corrupted by sudden fortune, but who held firm to a certain etiquette and a certain ethos that was becoming foreign within society. So the Beverly Hillbillies could have been simple-minded comedy, but it was also a kind of a critique of the materialistic society that the 60s were becoming. I think you see the same thing in Green Acres. You see the same thing in a number of these programs that they are Gilligan's Island, Theater of the Absurd. I think that they are shows that are unfairly panned, and I think that they to a certain extent, they are perhaps unfairly blamed for the shows that came after them. I don't know if My Mother the Car has any particularly redeeming qualities, if it was meant to be a satire or a take on familial relationships or something with an Oedipal subtext to it. I don't know if it was meant to show any of those things, but I can pretty much guarantee that whatever concept show it was that inspired it, it did not live up to that show.
So we did talk in a show about uh, variety shows. We mentioned Laugh-In Sullivan and
Yep.
that, so we won't rehash that now. But one of the things in the 60s that was sort of in concert and with the variety shows, I think, because they were the first to really show the counterculture of that day, was some of the game shows. And I'm thinking of three game shows specifically. Hollywood Squares, which had that kind of attitude, and it also had a prominent gay man, Paul Lynde, that became the breakout star. And the two others were created by Chuck Barris, one of TV's most interesting characters, The Newlywed Game and The Dating Game,
Yeah.
which some people forget he created. They concentrate on The Gong Show and the $1.98 Beauty Show a decade later. But Barris was sort of this really odd figure, but both of those games push it even farther than Hollywood Squares in terms of risqueness.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to talk about those trio of shows and their impact.
Well, Chuck Barris is a guilty pleasure of mine. I love the guy, even though I think that some of his programming was of questionable taste. There was something so genuine about him within that. The shows themselves are, I think, the Hollywood Squares, first of all, because it is the antithesis of the kind of very formal game show that we had seen up to that point. There were two kinds of quiz shows. There was a show like What's My Line, which is very formal. The panelists are all addressed as Mr. or Miss. They're all dressed in evening wear, and the contestants come on and they try to guess their occupations. It's a very stylized, formal show. The other kind of show you see is a show like The Price is Right, the original version of The Price is Right, where you have people competing for prizes, and that appeals more to the materialistic greed and avarice side of us, although I'm not accusing any of the people involved on those shows of being that way. And you had shows like Concentration that actually required some wit and cleverness to try to figure out the rebus puzzle that was at the center of it. But then you introduce a show like the Hollywood Squares, which is really, I think, a comedy dressed up as a game show. The prizes are there. The money is not insignificant. The ability to win some big money prizes is there. But what it really is an occasion for celebrities to give outrageous double entendres as answers to certain questions. And Paul Lynde is just the most notable case of that. But if you go through all of the best known people who are on that show, Wally Cox and Charlie Weaver, and different George Gobel, different characters like that, and you read their answers, and even today, there's something about them that is that they're all hilarious. I love the Hollywood
And mostly they were
Squares.
scripted too. The
Yes,
answers.
yes, they were, and your talent depended on your ability to be able to make it sound like they
Yeah.
weren't.
Yeah.
Although I think at the beginning, some of Paul's answers were ad libs, but by very shortly it became more and more of a scripted type of show. Although, if I'm remembering correctly, Peter Marshall said once that they were very careful that they never gave them the correct answer. They gave them the jokes, but they never gave the celebrities the correct answer. So that was still up to them to decide what to do with it. They might suggest something, but they wouldn't let them know for sure it was the correct answer. But that was all it was. It was an excuse for delivering racy one-liners and humor that you might wince at. It was very provocative daytime programming, I think. And when they brought in Storybook Squares, which was a Saturday morning version of it, where they had mostly the same celebrities, but the celebrities played nursery school characters. That toned that one down a little bit because they weren't going to be able to make some of the same jokes that they did during the day. But you're correct. I think it was a real break from what we thought of as game shows. Then they're really more like, well, the next two shows you mentioned, the Newlywed Game and the Dating Game, are really more like early examples, I think, of reality shows than they are game shows. But in both cases, you have real people appearing on the show. In the case of the Newlywed Game, you have couples that have been married for less than a year or less than a year and a half, something like that. They had a very elastic definition of the phrase newlywed. But you had another situation where the questions often involved, like, where is the strangest place you've made whoopee? And they were invitations for this time, instead of the answers, the questions were double entendres, and the answers were always going to be subject to misunderstandings and subject to riposts from Bob Eubanks, the host, but always in good humor. The Dating Game is even the next step in the evolution, where you have usually what you had were three bachelors and a bachelorette, sometime or a bachelor and three bachelorettes, and the contestant. The contestant is anonymous. They're all separated, so the bachelorettes can see each other. They're all on one side, the bachelors on the other side, and they're asking questions. And the questions are, without question, they're verging on bad taste. Even back then in the liberated era, they're verging on very suggestive things. When you're talking about friction not as a mathematical or engineering equation, but as something much different from that, even though it's employing the same principles, you're getting into all kinds of things. These were really, reality show, thinly disguised sex comedies that everybody hated except the viewers. The critics, except I think the Hollywood Squares was not, but certainly the Dating Game and the Newlywed Game, the critics mostly hated them, the viewers did not.
The Dating Game is also famous on YouTube nowadays because there's probably about 4 or 5 dozen people who became celebrities who were dating. I think Farrah Fawcett, Steve Martin,
Tom Selleck, I think, was.
Tom Selleck may have been one of them. John Ritter, I know, was on it.
Yep. Rod McEwen was one of the celebrity bachelors once, asking questions of the bachelorettes.
Yeah. So it's quite a who's who pickings there.
One last footnote I wanted to mention on that. There was an article about the Dating Game in TV Guide, and talking about the fabulous places that they would send people to, and they were always chaperoned, and occasionally Chuck Barris himself would be the chaperone. Well, many years later when Chuck
Because he was going to
Barris.
kill people.
Yes, yes. And when he wrote Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, in which he alleged that he was actually a hitman for the CIA, and he was explaining in the context that one of the reasons you would send a couple for their fabulous date to Reykjavik, Iceland, was because he could go on a hit in Iceland that he wasn't able to do in Paris. And you find yourself reading this article in TV Guide, and they're talking about some of the places Barris would accompany people, and you start to actually find yourself thinking, I wonder why he chose that place to take them. Barris's stories always were full of some measure of plausibility that made you think, well, he could have been a spy.
So I wanted to talk about not necessarily a genre, but the 1960s did see the emergence of nature and animal-based shows across the spectrum. There were situational situation comedies. There was Flipper, the dolphin. There was Gentle Ben, the bear. There was Lassie, the dog. Then there were, of course, the supernatural one, Mr. Ed, that could speak.
Yep. Doctari, which
Tari
wasn't really a
one.
comedy, but it was still in the same field.
And then you had stuff like Jacques Cousteau underwater specials. You had Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdoms and 3 or 4 knockoffs by other companies that supported. Where did this sort of bubble up to? Because it seemed to come, and then, with the exception of Jacques Cousteau and Mutual of Omaha, which lasted in some form for maybe 15, 20 years later, at least for the scripted shows for animals, that came and went in just a few years.
Yeah, I don't, National Geographic had specials on a regular basis as well. I don't know. I am going to hazard a guess that as people became more conscious, more aware of a treatment of animals, whether you want to call it animal rights or ethical treatment or what have you, I think that there were some reservations about the way in which some of these programs obtained their footage. We now know, for example, that a lot of the scenes in Disney's nature movies were staged. And even Marlon Perkins admitted having staged some of the scenes in Wild Kingdom. I think that there may have been some consciousness of that. I think that there may have been some kind of a backlash against some of the nature shows, the ones that were genuine nature shows like that. As far as the scripted shows like Gentle Ben or Lassie, I think they became a victim of that rural purge. Even though there isn't anything necessarily rural about them, it certainly falls into the same demographic. You could lump Lassie in with a show like Green Acres or Hee Haw or anything, in that similar audiences, similar demographics might watch them. They become less desirable for the advertisers. And as a result, those kinds of really family-friendly shows tend to drift away. And it would be a guess, but I would say that probably had something to do with the scripted end of it.
So another thing that bubbled up, that we talked about some of the shows like Outer Limits, Twilight Zone, and I'm sure we'll talk about Star Trek, because I do plan on us doing a show on just science fiction shows in general. But so I think we can sort of come back to that, because they're well known and there's stuff there. I did want to talk about a few other things here. One is the rise of talk shows, and I'm thinking in the 1960s. You mentioned David Susskind, who was a movie and television producer. He had a show called Open End on WNET in New York, which they'd go 3 or 4 hours sometimes. It later became the David Susskind Show. Phil Donahue premiered, I think, in 67 or 68 in Dayton, Ohio. Dick Cavett went from writing for some of the comedy shows of the 50s and 60s to getting his own talk show. Johnny Carson, of course, ascended to the Tonight Show throne. Bill Buckley on public television started with his show Firing Line. And I want to mention one other guy who was not nearly as famous and his shows were not nearly as good, but that's Joe Pine, who was sort of a
Yes.
precursor to Rush Limbaugh and Morton Downey Jr. and that stuff. So talk to me about some of these names and some of these shows, because it seems that the 1960s set the template for the
Hmm.
modern talk show, whether it's the serious show on politics or whether it's the celebrity chat.
Yeah, I think you're right. When the '60s begin, you have one show really that stands above all others in that genre, and that's The Tonight Show. And as the decade dawns, Jack Paar is host of The Tonight Show. And it's really more than anything else the Jack Paar Show. He disagreed with that. He didn't like it to be called that. But the show is so completely a reflection of Parr's persona that it is radically different from what it was like when Steve Allen was the host, for example. But Jack Paar has the quintessential talk show. You can argue, I think, with some success or some plausibility that a show like the Today Show was sort of a talk show, even though is a news and information show and it had entertainers on there, but it was comprised of a lot of smaller interviews that would take place during the course of the show, and you'd see the same guests off and on Today and Tonight within a period of time. The other talk shows I think you see at the beginning of the decade tend to be local shows, and it's maybe a spin-off of talk radio that you still had. You always had shows on radio that people called in for, so you had that kind of local sensibility. But you have Les Crane, who I suppose was the first person other than Carson to really be remembered as challenging the late night supremacy that Carson by that time had created. Carson replaces Parr in what, 62, I
Yeah,
think.
62 to
Si-
92 was when he reigned.
yeah.
30 years.
Okay. So by the mid 60s, Carson is fully established. But the first person to come along to try to take that on is to directly take him on is Les Crane. And Les Crane is known for being a very controversial personality from his local broadcasting. And his show does not take off. He gets two cracks at it on ABC, actually, and it does not work. So Les Crane exits the scene. You've got a couple of syndicated talk shows that are out there. One of them is Steve Allen, who's returned to the talk show format. He does that periodically, and he has a show on Westinghouse Broadcasting. You have Mike Douglas, who has an afternoon talk show that is more geared to popularly thought at least, is geared to the housewife, although
Yeah.
Douglas does take on some fairly sharp topics during his long run.
And he had a very famous interview with John Lennon, I believe.
Yes, John and Yoko were guest hosts of his for the entire, or co-hosts for an entire week.
Yeah.
if you can imagine that. And then you had Merv Griffin.
Yeah.
And Merv had started out on NBC. He had actually been one of the finalists for The Tonight Show, and the story is that NBC gave him a daytime show when they hired Carson, because they weren't sure if Carson was going to work. And if Carson didn't work, they wanted his replacement right there, so that there wouldn't be any waiting period as they'd had to go through when they hired Carson. They could just bring Merv into the seat. Well, Carson does work, but Merv winds up having his syndicated show. So you've got Carson on the national scene, on the network scene, and then you have 3 or 4 very popular shows that are being shown in syndication. Pretty soon, ABC wants to take another crack at late night programming, and that's when they bring in Joey Bishop. Now, Joey Bishop was well known as a nightclub comedian, as part of the Rat Pack. He'd had a very successful sitcom for a number of years on TV, and he had also been a frequent guest host on The Tonight Show when Johnny was not appearing. So he was well known to the public, and he was also well known in that genre. And Joey Bishop takes over on late night on ABC, and his sidekick is Regis Philbin, who had been a host in Los Angeles and had done very well locally. And so now he is the sidekick for Joey Bishop. And ABC has a lot of trouble getting clearance for Bishop's show. Not all the affiliates pick him up, and when they do, some of them delay his show for an hour or even 2 hours because they want to show their local movies or something else that will generate more commercial revenue, advertising revenue for them. So Bishop has kind of an uphill battle. Despite that, he actually does very well against Carson. We have been brought up to think that Bishop's quest was hopeless from the beginning. It was not. Carson had not been, Carson was popular. He was established, but he was not an institution. And there were entire weeks when Bishop would beat him in the ratings. But Carson had enough swing in the entertainment business that he started to put the word out sotto voce that if you appear on a Bishop show, you're not going to appear on mine. So if you want to be on the Tonight Show, you're not going to be on the Bishop show. And that really cut into Bishop's pool of talent. Even though Bishop, I believe, was doing his show from Hollywood, Carson, at least through the 60s, is still doing his show in New York. But
and didn't something similar happen with Jerry Lewis when he tried to do it?
Yeah. Lewis is an interesting topic too, because he had a 90-minute talk show that was on weekly, not nightly, but weekly. It was on Saturday nights, and it was on ABC. It was the most expensive television show in history to that point. He was the highest paid person on television, and it was a colossal flop. I think not because it was a terrible show, though it was not a good show, but it was the risk return on the investment was not there. The show wasn't worth all of the fuss and all of the money that the network was pouring into it, plus having to deal with Lewis's ego. And so they canceled the show, remodeled the Jerry Lewis Theater, changed its name to the Hollywood Palace, and created a variety show to go in there. But I think that when you think of the Jerry Lewis show, you're tempted to put it in as a variety show, but it really was a talk show format. You're right. What happens anyway is that as we approach the end of the 60s, you've got Carson on NBC. You still have Bishop on ABC, although he's starting to struggle and he's being a little difficult for the network. CBS decides that they want to get into the nightly game. Now, what's interesting is that this happens at about the same time that Carson is starting to renegotiate his contract with NBC. And there are rumors that Carson may go to ABC or CBS instead. Imagine Late Night with Johnny Carson on CBS. It's an interesting idea. But there are rumors that he's going to move. And in that case, there are also rumors that NBC has targeted Bob Newhart as the new host of The Tonight Show. Very interesting. What could have been if that had worked? Would Newhart have gone on to do his own sitcom? I don't know. Anyway, what happens is that CBS finally decides that rather than develop their own talk show, homegrown talk show, they buy one. They buy Merv's show. So they bring Merv Griffin out of syndication, lock, stock, along with Arthur Treacher, his sidekick. They bring the whole show over to CBS and start it up there. So at this point, for the first time in network television history, you have 3 late night talk shows. You have Johnny, you have Merv, and you have Joey. And you now also have another contender in syndication, not only Mike Douglas, but you also have David Frost, who has parlayed his fame in England as an interviewer and as a participant on That Was the Week That Was. He's become a talk show host, and he's having some very interesting shows. And his show is being shown in syndication and It's on sometimes in the daytime, sometimes in the evenings, sometimes late at night, depending on the station and the ownership links that station may have. But he's coming on late night as well, and so. Finally, what happens is there's a contract dispute between Joey Bishop and ABC, and Bishop walks off the show, leaves. He walks off almost in the same way that Jack Parr walked off tonight that time, and it leaves everything in flux. And so, for the remainder of the year 1969. They have guest hosts on the Joey Bishop Show. At the end of 1969, which is a good place for us to stop because it brings us to the end of the 60s, Dick Cavett comes in. Dick Cavett had a morning program, a 5-day-a-week morning program for a while. It then moved to a 3-night-a-week primetime program where they were keeping him to see what happens. And when a Bishop quits, they move Cavett into that time spot. So at the end of the decade, you have Johnny, you have Merv, and you have Dick. And pretty soon what's going to happen is Merv is tired of the battling he has with CBS over the guests that he wants to have. He goes back to syndication. Cavett show runs out of time. They reduce it to 1 week a month in a concept called Wide World of Entertainment, and they bring back Jack Parr. And all of these shows drop by the wayside, so that until you come to Pat Sajak, David Letterman, we're getting far afield of the 60s, but at the end of the 60s, Johnny is still the king. And there's one show that I forgot to mention that I should, because it's so little known that I should take a moment to mention it. It was called The Bill Dana Show from Las Vegas, and it was part of a projected new network. And it was the first, and as it turns out, the only show that network carried. It got pretty good clearance, because at this point both ABC and particularly CBS were looking for a late night show to put on against Carson. And so the Bill Dana Show did very well for about a week. And now I can't remember if it only ran a week or if it got to be a little longer than a week. But the network essentially ran out of money. It did maybe a month. It was called the United Network, by the way, and it was going to be home to a lot of programming and sporting events that never took off. But it was, the formal name of the show was the Las Vegas Show, because it was from Las Vegas. It was 2 hours. It was very well reviewed. He had a lot of big name guests on the show, but the network just wasn't there to keep it going, and it crumbled within a month.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention before we move on, David Susskind show was weekly from New York, and
so was Buckley's too. Firing Line was a week show
and,
too.
Unlike Dick Cavett did sometimes have odd guests, but there was still mostly celebrity. But Susskind he'd have Truman Capote on for 2 hours. He'd have a mafia hitman on for an hour and a half.
He'd do a show with prostitutes on,
and then he'd have 6 or 7 people who claim to have been abducted by aliens.
Yep, transvestites, conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, so that was an interesting show. So I just wanted
Susskind was always Susskind was often more interesting even than some of his guests. But we ought to do a show about Susskind someday, because he's just an interesting character.
So. You had said you misspoke.
The Bill Dana Show. It was originally the network we were talking about. It wound up being the United Network, but it started out as the Overmyer Network, and that's where the historical research is in talking about the Overmyer Network. And if you ever want to read about the rise and fall of a network, this makes the Dumont network look like the Tiffany network in comparison to read about the struggles of Overmeyer. But sometimes those names just don't come to you in the heat of conversation.
Yeah. So at some point, maybe we'll do a show on the rise and fall of Saturday morning TV, because the '60s is really when that got kicked off. But so we'll save that for another time. I did want to talk about one other sort of 1960s emergence, and then I want to talk about an old favorite, Lucille Ball. But so let me just talk about the 1960s saw the rise. I mentioned JT, I mentioned House Without a Christmas Tree, the Waltons TV special. But the 1960s saw the rise of what we'd call some kinds of animated television for Christmas shows. The first one was Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, which I think is an outstanding. I did I think a whole show on that. I don't know why it doesn't hold up the way some of the other ones did. Charlie Brown, of course, The Grinch, Frosty the Snowman, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. It seemed that Rankin Bass, then by the '70s they were churning out something every year. Same thing with Charlie Brown. So talk to me about why did we go? Because if you look at the '50s, every show, even shows like game shows, would have their Christmas special with a tree in the background, and they bring on some orphans at the end of a game show and give them presents and whatnot. But the early '60s seemed to just breed. Every year there was a new, what would become a classic staple. What was it about the '60s that brought that about, do you think?
I don't know. I think part of it was the sheer ability to be able to do it. The Peanuts special, in retrospect, isn't a big surprise because those characters had actually been on TV for a while. They had been the animated introduction to the Tennessee Ernie Ford show featured the Peanuts characters, and in animation, looking exactly the way they would in the TV specials, and they had been in commercials. So in addition to being a popular comic strip, the Peanuts characters were a known commodity to viewers. But there was just this, I think, this burst of creativity that you had these novelty songs like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Frosty the Snowman, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, that were tailor-made for specials. And then you had a story like The Grinch, that Chuck Jones, great animator, Dr. Seuss, a great storyteller. These were wonderful animations, and Mr. Magoo, that was great stuff. And they weren't just kids cartoons. I mean, Mr. Magoo is a pretty faithful retelling of a Christmas Carol, and it has some great music in it as well, a quality, because it was written by a couple of Broadway composers. So I would guess that part of the growth in having cartoons for Christmas specials came from the popularity of the characters themselves. And part of it came from their ability. Once Rankin Bass had created, I think Mad Monster Party was probably their first, but after the success of Rudolph, doing more of these animatronic specials was certainly something that the networks would be interested in. So they had their blank check to be able to go and develop more shows of the same kind. And then as the '60s passed into the '70s, I think, if I can give an editorial opinion as opposed maybe to a historian's opinion, I look at the quality of animation itself when you get into the '70s and '80s, and you've got limited motion animation. You have animated cartoons that are now seen more as delivery systems for the products that they're advertising. You have cartoon characters who are themselves products, rather than having a product developed from the popularity of a show. You have a show developed from the popularity of a product. And a lot of you had a Santa Bear Christmas special, and Santa Bears is something you got for shopping at a department store. You spend so much money and you get this stuffed bear, and I know people who collect them. Santa Bear was a wonderful thing. I'm not trashing on the Santa Bear, the bear, but what I'm saying is that to do an animated special about Santa Bear is really just taking a commercial product and doing a cartoon around it. So I would venture to say that the reason these shows dropped in popularity is perhaps simply because they weren't very good anymore. That the animation wasn't very good, that the impetus for the inspiration for them wasn't very good. The stories weren't very good. I don't know why so many of them dropped off the network. I don't know why Mr. Magoo left. If you're going to watch it today, be sure to watch the DVD version because it's uncut. But when they did bring Magoo back for occasional showings on USA or even on NBC, they've carved the thing up so that it's almost unrecognizable to anybody who knows what it really is. And they do the same thing with the others too. There are some scenes missing from Rudolph that shouldn't be there. There were scenes cut out of Charlie Brown Christmas that shouldn't have been. But I think that it is unfortunate, but I think that it perhaps was lightning in a bottle. Charlie Brown Christmas is magic. It's the Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown is magic. But by the time you get down to an Arbor Day special or some other kind of specials, they start to lose their magic, and you can only do so many of them, and maybe that's it. Maybe you can only do so many Christmas shows, and then you run out of it. But
there was the Charlie Brown one where Snoopy's brother Spike from the desert comes to visit him, and it's like, what?
Yeah, you're creating an entire Charlie Brown universe, and you're looking for an excuse to show it. And for that matter, again, we'll talk about this at another time, but they had a regular Saturday morning Charlie Brown and Snoopy series for a couple of years. That was really much better than some of the specials because it was really based on the strips themselves, whereas some of the Charlie Brown specials later on were like, again, it was a special looking for an excuse to be done.
So in the 1960s, Lucille Ball had 3 television shows. The last year or two of the Lucy Desi Hour in the early 60s. Mm-hmm. Then she did the Lucy Show from 62 to 68. And then Here's Lucy from 68 to 74. And I'll talk about each of those shows in a moment. But it's notable, historically speaking, that Lucille Ball and her then, still husband, soon to be ex-husband, Desi Arnaz, formed Desi Lou, a production company. It becomes basically, to the 1960s, what MTN would later become in the 70s. Yep. It becomes a factory of hit after hit. And then Lucy buys Desi out when they divorce, and she becomes the first head of Hollywood studio, television or whatnot. And she's the mother of Star Trek, some people say. Let's talk first about Desi Lou, the studio, the ups and downs of it, and then we can talk about the 3 shows.
Well, I think that the downs of Desi Lou, to my way of thinking, come when it's bought out by Paramount. Because it had been it was almost like a family business up until then. It had some extremely successful shows, but in addition to Lucy's show, at the time it was bought out by Paramount, its 2 big shows were Mission Impossible and Star Trek, which was I think was still on when Paramount took over. Yeah, the 3rd season. And what happened when Paramount took over was that it started to apply budgetary big business thinking to it. And so that was when Mission Impossible started to struggle, when they cut the budget, when they started to, when they put their own people in charge of overseeing what was going on with the show, with the scripts, with the talent, with the negotiations. I think that was where you really saw the end of Desilu, not just in name, but in what the production company stood for. But if you look at the highs of Desilu, well, you've got these two very successful shows. You've got Mission Impossible and Star Trek, which are both high concept shows of a type, but they are shows that need to be sold to a network because one of them is science fiction, one of them is very sophisticated, and they needed somebody who was willing to push those shows. And Desilu is willing to do that, whether in the person of Lucy herself, who liked both of those shows, or in the idea of just the having the company behind it. That was important. You go back farther in Desilu's history to their first big hit outside of the Lucy Desi situation, I think, was The Untouchables. And that would have been a Desi type of show. He introduced it on Desilu Playhouse. The pilot for The Untouchables was on. And when Frank Sinatra became angered about the way Italian Americans were being portrayed on television, it was Desi that he went to and threatened to kill or to deal with if they didn't tone down the Italian stereotypes on the show. So you look at the history of this very small production company in comparison to some of the giants, and you see that they had a profound impact on some of the most successful shows of the 60s. And I think that I know Lucy was reluctant to sell. She finally did, and she felt she had done the right thing, but I would like to see how she felt about it a while down the road, because I think she would have been disappointed at the interference with a show like Mission Impossible, although she might have understood why. I think she still would have been disappointed, and certainly a lot of the people who worked there were disappointed in it, and I think that was the end of an era.
So basically, the Lucy Desi hour was a holdover from the 50s, and it was sort of a stopgap. It was sort of formless after the 6 or 7 season run of I Love Lucy, because Lucy went from 51 to 74, 24 straight years of being on television with the show.
Incredible run.
And then we get the Lucy Show, which is a good, solid comedy. It introduces people to Gail Gordon as a comic lead. You have Vivian Vance there as the number 2 again. It's got a typical setup. She's back in the workforce and whatnot. And I think it was a good, solid show. And then for me, Here's Lucy was a show that I think had so much potential, but I think made some bad choices, because here it is, 1968. She's back on television. She's the mother of 2 teenage kids. It's the counterculture of the 60s. There's a few shows that they deal with that, and then I think it's by the end of the second season that the 2 kids are shunted off, and they sort of rejigger the whole concept. And to me, as Lucy got older, and by this time she would have been 68, she would have been 60. So by then, by the time that starts, she's a 60-year-old woman. You can hear it in her voice with the years of smoking. She looks a lot older. For me, I would have loved to see that show deal with more topical comedy. I think it could have been a precursor to what was done by Norman Lear's shows a few years later. And yet they totally passed on that. And to me, Here's Lucy, it just never picked up after their first year of promise. It sort of went in the tank. So what is your take on those 3 shows, if you want to go chronologically?
What's interesting about the Lucy show is that it was a very soft sequel to I Love Lucy, because if you look at I Love Lucy, that was itself based on the radio series My Favorite Husband, which Lucy had starred in with Richard Denning on the radio. And And although it doesn't get a whole lot of attention, there was a sequel to My Favorite Husband that dealt with Lucy's character after her husband had died. She was a widow and she was now returning back to the workforce, doing the same kinds of things that she does in Here's Lucy, although the names have changed and everything. And you can certainly understand, because of how loved I Love Lucy was, you can understand that they would not want to give you a show that was presuming that Desi was dead and Lucy was now doing her thing. But you can, in a plot sense, kind of think of it as a very loosely constructed sequel to I Love Lucy. It's just that the names have been changed to protect the innocent. My recollection, at least in part, was that Lucy did the Here's Lucy to get a chance to work with her children, and that is why it is something of a surprise that she didn't make better use of them, or that the show didn't make better use of them. But Lucy was a cash cow for CBS. Their negotiations were often somewhat prolonged, and one of the reasons that Lucy, as the head of Desilu, had so much clout with CBS, or at least had as much clout as she did, one of the reasons was because she could get a show like Mission Impossible or Star Trek because there was the Lucy Show. By whatever title. I'm just speaking of a generic Lucy show. And if CBS wants Lucy, they best do something to take Mission Impossible. That's one way to look at it. And I don't know if Lucy was becoming more detached from the business at that point in time of the actual acting. I think that she was getting tired of it to a certain extent. She was certainly talking every year about not knowing if she wanted to go on with a show, and that may not at that point have been a negotiating ploy anymore. But you talk about what Here's Lucy could have been, and I think in retrospect, it might have been a much smarter idea if the show had been something even like the Doris Day show, where you had a woman who is now a single woman again, whether by divorce or by widowing. And by the way, just as a footnote, Vivian Vance's character on the Lucy show was the first divorced woman to be a regular on in a TV series. She was all the other principal characters in sitcoms, particularly to that point, had been widows or widowers. She was the first to be a divorced woman to be in a series. But Doris Day, as a woman going back, a successful career woman, without the slapstick, without the sight gags, without the Lucy persona of getting herself into and out of situations. Now, maybe that wouldn't have worked for Lucy, but I think she was a talented actress as well as being a smart businesswoman. And I don't think it is out of the realm of possibility that if they had chosen to do a show like that, with the children or without the children, because Doris Day did it both ways. They kept changing the format, but they could have done it as a sitcom that would have allowed, as you suggest, a much wider range of topics. Maybe having it be a little toned down, not so much of the slapstick traditional Lucy thing. I think it could have been a very good show. Would it have been as successful, or were they already sold into the idea that there is a certain kind of Lucy show and we have to adhere to that format?
Yeah.
Maybe that's it. I will say one of my favorite episodes of the post I Love Lucy period is a wild satire that they do on The Untouchables, which they were able to do, of course, because of the show's connection to Desilu. And this is in color. This may have been on, I think this was the Lucy show, but it was a color episode. So we're talking later in the 60s, and it's this wild parody where they have Robert Stack playing an FBI agent, and they have Walter Winchell doing the narration, and they have Bruce Gordon playing a mobster. All of them in virtually the same characters that they had from The Untouchables, and Lucy is supposed to be a dead ringer for Bruce Gordon's femme fatale Moll that he had when he was free, but he's just getting out of prison, and they're asking her to pose as the Moll to try to find out where his character hid all the money. It's a wonderful concept, and as a satire, as a spoof of the show, and as a comedy, it works very well. It's a very funny episode, but it doesn't rely on some of the same tropes. It only relies on Lucy getting herself into a situation she's not so sure she wants to be in. I think they would have had the potential for more things like that, perhaps.
Yeah, I know. If you look at I Love Lucy, it was basically physical comedy.
Yep.
Lucy doing this or that, whether it's the famous with the candy going down the belt, or stomping the grapes, or Vita Veta Vegemin, or whatever it was. But by the time she hits, excuse me, she was actually born in 1911. She was only 57, I guess, when Here's Lucy shows up. But still, a woman nearing her dotage, at least. And I think that show especially, Here's Lucy is the middle show, but not Here's Lucy. The Lucy show is the middle show. But by Here's Lucy, she's really just too old for the physical comedy. Yes. You can see her creaking, and yet I think she was much better. She was much saucier the way she delivered some of her lines, and that's why I think that had they portrayed her as the old, out-of-touch mother with the hipster kids who are coming to say, if they had done an episode with, a Latino family moves down the block onto their street, and Lucy reacts and learns a lesson, I think that would have played much more into her comedic strengths then. It's like they didn't let Lucy grow older.
Yeah. That she was frozen in time as a character, and
they depended so much on guest episodes. Liz and Dick, she meets Liz and Dick. She meets this guy. I would estimate probably 2 out of every 5 shows, 40% of the shows, Lucy's meeting someone famous in the show.
John Wayne, everybody and you don't know if it's a ratings ploy, or if they're trying to keep the show afloat, or if they're just relying on Lucille Ball's old friends from Hollywood to spice things up. But it could have been a progenitor of Golden Girls too, with Lucy and Ethel together. Yeah. It could have gone in many different directions other than the direction it did go in.
Well, let's end it here. We've covered the 1960s fairly well. Those little bits, like I mentioned, we'll probably get to when we do specific shows about specific genres. So thanks again, and it was a pleasure to talk to you as always.
It's a lot of fun, and I want to sum up the 60s in one way of thinking about it, that in 1 year, you had a perfect convergence of the decades. You had 3 shows on the air. All of them were on ABC. One of them was the Donna Reed show. One of them was The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. And one of them was Batman. There is a reason why the 60s are so much fun. And I thoroughly enjoyed talking about them with you. Thanks, as always, for having me on.
And we'll be back in a month or 2 with something else.
Looking forward to it. And happy holidays to all of you out there. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Arbor Day. Oh, wait.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Plant a tree for me.